I would now like to turn to our main presentation for today. Fitchburg is home to Wisconsin's first successful government fish hatchery. Although easily accessible, relatively few people have actually visited this important facility that has helped transform Wisconsin tourism. Today we are fortunate to have Jason Himebauch to describe the inner workings of the Nevin Fish Hatchery and its role in harvesting eggs, rearing fish, stocking and monitoring fish in Wisconsin. An avid fisherman from his youth, he might even be able to give you some tips on where to catch that big fish. Jason obtained his double major in fisheries management and biology at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point in 1997. He worked his way up the ladder, working at both the Nevin and Lake Mills fish hatcheries, and is currently the hatchery foreman at the Nevin Fish Hatchery. His duties not only involve the rearing of fish, but managing the machinery, reacting to natural events such as the recent heavy rains, and controlling predatory animals that enjoy free meals at the raceways and ponds. Let's give Jason a hand coming up.
Good afternoon, everybody. We'll see if we can get this to work. We do a lot of public speaking, but those are people that usually come to the hatchery to see us, so usually they want to be there. So, and I'm glad you guys, hopefully you all want to be here too. So, well, while we're waiting for this to kind of load up, I brought over a few different sort of items to kind of show off different things. I know this is older than me. I have no idea how old this is, but it kind of shows the life cycle as it goes on from egg over here to all the way up to roughly stocking size. For whatever odd reason, it shows northern pike eggs just for scale in the far jar. So the presentation overview, I'm going to talk very briefly about the history of Nevin State Fish Hatchery, some of our hatchery production, visual hatchery tour with some photographs. Day-to-day operations will probably be the largest part of the talk. Challenges to what we're doing over there. And at the end, if we get time, and hopefully if it works, I'm not sold, got some videos to show. I'm guessing they're probably not going to play, but we'll see. I'll try to be optimistic on that one, about habitat and improvement. So here's my brief history. You all in this room probably know a lot more about Nevin Fish Hatchery than I ever will. But as Alan said, it is the oldest of all the state-owned hatcheries by the state of Wisconsin. Unconfirmed, but I think it's kind of a neat thing. I think it is the oldest not-for-profit restoration hatchery in the U.S. And what does that mean? Well, we don't sell any fish. We get a lot of calls for people to sell fish, and there's times where I would love to sell a bunch of extra fish we have, but we can't sell any fish. All of our fish get stocked into water bodies of the state. So as far as we know, this is the oldest one in the whole U.S., which is really cool, I think. It opened in 1876, named after James Nevin. He was the first superintendent of fisheries back in the early 20s. And Nevin is one of 3 DNR hatcheries that supply the state with all of the inland stocked trout. The other being Osceola and St. Croix Falls, which are up in the northwestern part of the state. This is kind of why hatcheries began. You can all read the slide. Hopefully, it's really hard with the, oh, it looks better on the big screen. Back then, when things were clear-cut, there wasn't a lot of vegetation to hold the banks, and so when you got these rain events in the southwestern part of the state, it's very hilly, and the streams have high gradient, which makes run riffle pool habitat. So back then, there was a ton of erosion. Sediment filled the valley floor. Sediment covered up spawning habitat. And it's the exposed rocks aren't only for spawning, it's for different fish, utilize different types of insects that live within the rocks. When all that's covered up by silt or sediment or vegetation, the trout just can't survive. So that same photo, back in the 1820s, brook trout were the primary stream species. There was no browns. There was no rainbows. They were all, brook trout was the only native trout to streams of Wisconsin. Again, 1880s through the 40s, heavy erosion fills the valley floor. And by the 40s, warm water species now dominant. Or probably should be now dominate. But warm water species like creek chubs, white suckers, I mean, there's a ton. There's about 150 different species of fish native to Wisconsin. I bet we can all name probably 20 really fast. You know, walleye, brown trout, rainbow trout. You know, you could go through the line, and after about 20, it's pretty tough. There's a lot of different shiners and minnows and sculpin and darters, which I really liked when I worked a different job. Do we all know what this fella is? Anybody know what this is? Right in front. Close. No, it's not a yellow perch. And I want this tour, if you guys have questions while we're going, I want it to be very casual. This is how I run my tours at work. If we're walking around, I'm going to be throwing out a lot of information, a lot of numbers, a lot of stuff. If you've got questions, just raise your hand and we can cover it right then. I know I have very low, I can't keep a thought pattern real long, so if I wait to the end of these things to ask questions, I can't ever remember. This is the common carp. Not native to Wisconsin or the U.S. Back in the early days of Nevin Hatchery, this guy was one of the fish they propagated there. Worked out pretty well for us, didn't it? So what were they thinking? You know, our descendants, most of ours were probably from Europe, and this is a revered game fish in Europe. So they're like, okay, let's bring this fish back here and let's make it like home. Well, these invasive species, they might not have natural predators. They're prolific spawners. They grow really fast, so they kind of take over. So that's an invasive species. This is what we would love to have more of. These are one of the 3 trout we raise at Nevin. This is the brook trout, and this version is a male brook trout. And I had to show these pictures because I love this artist. All these photos or these prints are done with colored pencils. Super cool. And that's pretty good, the picture compared to the real thing. I don't want to say that's a giant brookie, but that's pretty large for a stream fish. That's probably about 11 inches long. There's our brown trout, not native to Wisconsin. It came from Europe as well. It is acclimated very well. It's probably the most common stream trout. Well, it's actually not even close. It is the most common stream trout. There's a larger version of it. And this one, I believe, was taken from the west branch of the Sugar River. And wow, that's really big on the screen. The take-home message is you can see the banks are covered with vegetation. They're not raw, eroded, and everything else. So when you get a high rain event like we seem to have around here every other week now, it doesn't blow out the sides and just tear it out. The water comes up and the energy dissipates out on the landscape, and it preserves some of the in-stream structures that they put into these streams. And you can see this guy, he's about my height, and it's just under waist deep. So the stream is probably only 6 or 7 feet wide and maybe 3 feet deep. That's pretty good habitat. Rainbow trout. This is the last one we raise at Nevin. Also, not really considered an invasive in that term. When you hear invasive, I always think of something detrimental. I mean, invasive, it's not native. It was also transferred from streams out west. Here is and they'll have a lot of different color patterns too. Bigger version of it. So, here's what we kind of get to on a yearly basis at Nevin. We do about just over 500,000 fish we stock out annually, and the breakdown is about 150,000 brooks, about 105,000 rainbows, and about 250,000 brown trout. So one of the other neat things about Nevin itself is we either directly stock or indirectly have an effect on 68 of the 72 counties, which is really quite interesting. We receive our rainbow trout as eyed eggs from the hatchery up at Osceola, and we also transfer about 500,000 brown trout eggs to St. Croix Falls every year that they then raise and stock out in the northern part of the state. So 68 of the 72. I know Menominee County we don't do anything in, and there's 3 other ones, and I can't remember which ones they are.
Why are you heavy on the browns?
Wow, how long of a talk do we want this to be?
Repeat the question for the video.
Why are we heavy on the browns? We're kind of like, we don't decide what is raised. We can only raise so many pounds of fish, us at the hatchery personally. We can only raise so many pounds of fish on the amount of water that we have. We're fulfilling quotas made by the fisheries biologists. And so they have much higher quotas for brown trout. We're definitely revisiting that now. And the reason why they choose browns over brooks, brown trout, brooks, and rainbows don't all have the same tolerance of water temperatures. Brookies are the most sensitive. They like water up to probably 65 degrees. Anything warmer than that, they tend to avoid. Whereas browns, they like it cold like the brookies, but they also can live in 70, 72 degree water. So most of the waters, it's kind of like when you hit the easy button. You can try to force brooks in there, and if they make it, great. If they don't, well then everything they did and everything we did was kind of for naught. So the browns, they know, are very, they can take advantage of a lot of different types of habitat. So we're trying to transition away from that, but it's not necessarily up to us, but we have a little bit of say in it and kind of how we do things. And hopefully I'll get into that as the talk goes on a little bit more. But the breakdown by species are small fingerling, brooks, you can all read it, 100,000, 200,000 browns, and they're pretty small. They're stocked typically in the spring. They're about 2 inches long. Both the top one, that's a little brown trout. The middle one are large fingerling fish, and those are stocked out usually by around the middle of October. Those are all stocked into streams, and they're about 4 inches long, quite a bit larger. And the only thing, for the most part, that we stock as yearling or catchable size are those rainbow trout. And that's because they're a domesticated strain versus the wild strain brooks and browns. And I will get into that as we go along as well. So I kind of utilized an existing slideshow that contained a lot of these different these interpretive signs we have at the hatchery itself. Who all here has been to the hatchery? Raise your hand. Quite a few. Good. So those of you that have been there know it's not a real big place. We do a lot of fish on not a lot of water and space. I always like this slide because it shows a couple different things I think are really neat. The Badger fish car, back in the early 1900s, that's how they were able to transfer fish around for stocking. We have a lot of these. Being that we're at such an old facility, we have tons of these old books in our office. And some of them are, the kids these days have no chance of reading this because it's all in nice, clean cursive, but it explains a ton about what happened, not only at the facility, but people would go on this train car up to, I think the caption on the photo, and you probably can't read it on here, but they were coming back from Woodruff with northern pike fry. Where they were going with them in those milk cans, I have no idea. They probably would just throw them in any water body, wherever. I wish we still had the gazebo up. That would be out in the front yard where it's super wet right now. And also that building would be super neat. Oh, the pointer does work. Cool. That building would be kind of neat to work out of. I have no idea where that was on site. I've seen a lot of different pictures, but trying to triangulate where it was is kind of a challenge. We do have this lithograph, and I did forget that today, darn it. I was going to bring it, but it's this in a larger form, and it shows how the place used to be kind of designed. You can see there's a lot more water volume in that surface area of water than there is now. So that's probably when they tried raising those cursed carp. So the real reason why we are where we are is because of the amount of water that we have. We have about 1,400 gallons a minute of 50-degree water that flows every day. That equates to 2.2 million gallons that flow through the facility every day. A lot of people ask, oh, what do you guys do in the winter? Well, that water is 50, comes out of the ground, it's moving pretty quick. It doesn't freeze. So about the only difference we do summer to winter is we shovel snow instead of cut grass. Otherwise, everything else kind of stays the same. So it makes it interesting. But this photo is kind of bleached out, even on our signs, but it shows one of our spring collection boxes that we have on site. So that can be seen. But the best part about our place is it's a secure water source. It's not a diversion of surface water where we have to worry about high sediment load, pathogens, stuff like that. We don't use any chemicals on our fish at all except for salt. And that's mostly to help replace their slime coat when we handle the fish. That's about the only thing we ever use. We've been doing it so long, we know about how many pounds we can raise in each area of the facility, and we don't really stress the fish out too much where they get sick, which is a good thing. We're trying to stock out as healthy a fish as we can. So again, that's all we do, our trout. We do take tours around to look at all these signs, and I always ask the kids, you know, which ones are these, and they kind of struggle with it, but that's fine. They're not used to seeing 500,000 trout every day like I am. This also is a fairly old, and I wouldn't say super accurate representation of the fish, but we've got Brooks rainbows and browns in here, and the rainbow that are this size, that's about the size we stock most of those fish. I'll get back into that a little later. Here's an overview of the facility, probably taken pre-Pick and Save grocery store. I started down here in the late 90s, and you can kind of see, you follow the mouse, you can see there's a square pond over here. That is no longer there. That was filled in. But you can see our main hatchery building right here in the middle, that shed right there. Yeah, I can go back a slide. And our two ponds we use for rearing rainbow trout. And you can see there's an aerator running in that one, so that must be late spring before the fish get stocked out. So this is one of the first things you'll see when you come walking down the sidewalk. It's kind of our raceways here and our supply shed, kind of cruise on beyond that. This is our show pond. We have the 3 different types of trout we raise in there. As soon as the weather gets nice in the spring, that's when we get a lot of tours. And at that time of year, we don't have a lot of fish outside to see. We stock out a lot of our catchable size fish by the first Saturday in May. That's the fishing opener. So there's not much to see. So it's like as the weather gets nice, everybody comes out, and not much to see, so we always have these fish there. They don't really look that big in the photo, but most of them are probably over 20 inches long, which is really long for a trout. Here's some of our raceways. They have fish in them because they have this netting over the top, and that's to attempt to dissuade predators from getting at the fish real easily. We do a couple of different things. We try to run the water down as low as possible because that increases turnover rate. The fresher water comes in faster, and so it's a better environment for the fish, and then the birds can't get at them as easily. Yeah?
What are the fish's predators? So
I have a slide for that later on.
Okay.
We'll get to that. Good question, though. Here is one of our water sources. We've got different springs and wells at the facility. We don't really pump any water, so the water is flowing year-round, whether the power goes out in town here or not. So that's a very nice thing. We're not very technologically advanced for a hatchery, and there's definitely pros and cons to that. But for this aspect, that water is flowing no matter what. So this shows a screen. The water is falling through a screen, and there's also an aerator. It doesn't really need it to... The water in and of itself would probably be high enough oxygen content where the fish would be okay, but what we're doing here is driving off the nitrogen. The water has well water and spring water has a lot of dissolved nitrogen in it. So when you mechanically agitate it, it gets rid of the nitrogen and it replaces it with oxygen. So this is the head end of one of our lengths of raceway that's looking downstream. You can kind of see beyond the first screen here, there's covers over the top, and then these things are automated feeders, the black and green lidded items. Up here is where we keep our brood stock, our adult fish that we use for spawning. So we want them on the best water that we have available. We try to keep the raceways covered for predators, and the fish, we try to keep them as wild as we can, so that's why we have them on timer feeders. So we usually interact with those fish maybe once a day when we go up there and clean the screens and load the feeders. So we want to keep those fish as wild as we can. There, that's the same set of raceways looking upstream. On the lower end, the covered raceways are rainbow trout that we hold for a year and a half on site. So the netting again, you can see the water is kept down fairly low for hopeful predator control. Doesn't always work. Here's our 2 grow out ponds from the photo, from the aerial photo. It showed the 2 ponds out there. These are pretty large. We can fit about 30,000 in each pond, and so that really increases our carrying capacity of what we can raise there. So fish out there stay until they're about 8 inches long, and then they get stocked out. Here's another shot of our basement. That's what it looks like inside. We've got 36 linear tanks. Each one of the tanks runs about 15 gallons a minute through there. You can see in this photo the windows are all pretty much, they don't have any shade on them, and there's covers over the top of the tanks and automated feeders. We still use the automated feeders, but we don't have the shade covers any longer, and we keep the windows shaded. Mostly we raise brown trout in this building, and they just do not like the bright light in there. They don't like to eat. They're a challenge to raise. And hopefully I'll get into that later too. We have this is where the eggs incubate. It's on we have got a different set of jars where our wild strain trout incubate the eggs. So these are all custom made. There's a lot of this hatchery stuff that you just can't buy. You got to be able to think on your feet and custom make some of this stuff. I've made these, but I never came up with the idea. I'm clearly not that smart. But the eggs sit in here, and the water comes in. They're called upwelling jars. So the water will come in here through the base and make the eggs. If you put something under here to kind of tilt the jar, the eggs will roll. And that kind of mimics what they would do out in the wild. It keeps them from getting fungus and everything else. So they'll sit in there for about 35 days, give or take, before we start to move them someplace else. So each one of these yellow tags, the ones that have yellow tags have eggs in them. You can't even see, you can kind of see the eggs in the jar. No, not really. In the upper right. But the tags will say what strain it is, when it was spawned, how many eggs. It gives all the information we need going forward. So this was a big fight. Alan and Barb probably have heard me complain about this many, many, many times. We have this unbelievable water source at Nevin. It's high in nitrogen, which is fine. You can mechanically strip that off. But what it also had in the water was radon. So when we bring this water into the building and aerate it inside, it would drive off the nitrogen gas and the radon. So my supervisor years ago put out one of those Menards test kits for radon. I don't know why he did it. He just did, because he lives down in Monticello and he's got radon in his basement, so he had an extra kit or something. And we sent it in, and the numbers that came back were kind of like, whoa, that's really high. That test, that's a $10 test from Menards. How can that be correct? And so we had somebody come in with a meter to do radon readings, and it was unbelievably high. So high that it wasn't safe for us to work inside. And so what they had to do, we had to get this engineered. This whole deal out here was brand new a year and a half ago. So all of our spring and well water that feeds this building with water goes into this building and gets pumped up to the top part of the tower. pumped up to the top into here, and it falls down through media that break it up. So it pretty much does the same thing we were doing inside, but on a much larger scale outside. So it's got a blower system that blows air up through the top, and so it strips off the nitrogen and the radon outside.
Is that radon dissolved as a gas in the water, or is it connected to the water molecule, not more like a partial pressure?
The specifics of it, I'm not positive how it gets in there, but usually if you hear of radon in somebody's house, it's seeping up out of the basement cracks.
Yeah.
At first, that's kind of what we thought, but the floor, any cracks in the floor of the basement of the hatchery where those tanks were, there's water that comes in. I mean, it is so wet down there all the time that we finally figured out that it was us aerating the water inside was spiking the radon. So this machine, it only cost $500,000, but it was a good investment, not only for us, but in the state of somehow the DNR runs a little bit. It's some job security for us because they made a big investment, and what we do there is pretty special compared to some other places. So, but it works really well. There's some maintenance issues we have. If the power goes down now, it reverts back to artesian flow. So that was a really weird design. I don't need to spend too much time on that. I think it's pretty neat, but if you want to talk about it later or whatever, I've got cards in the back if you want to. If you guys have any questions or whatever later, that's fine. You can give me a buzz. Here's one of our buildings. As you can see, back in the 60s, it was probably pretty state-of-the-art. That's what it looks like inside. There is 12 linear tanks, and these tanks have probably 3 times the volume that our inside tanks have. We can run these about 25 gallons a minute. This building is called the Spiral Building, and I did not take a picture of the sign that we have out in front. I forgot about that, but there used to be a big spiral raceway in here. And if you follow the mouse, if I can get it on here, you can kind of see this edge here kind of curves. That used to be a huge tank inside there, just a spiral. A lot of surface area of water, but really hard to work with to get fish out of there and clean and everything else. So this building is on its own water source, about 350 gallons a minute, depending upon what time of year. And one other thing, when I first started down here in the late 90s, there was no grocery store across the street. This library wasn't here. There was a lot of ag. If you guys lived around here, you know what it was like. One thing we were always concerned about working at Nevin was the water volume going down, because that's how many fish we can raise is really determined on how much water flows through the facility. So we thought all this development would eventually cost us in water on site. So we're always kind of keeping track of the quality of the water, the flows, and everything else. For whatever weird reason, the water flow to this building never declined, but the oxygen level went from about 10 milligrams per liter to about 6. We still have no idea why. Well, 6 milligrams per liter is not enough oxygen to grow healthy trout. So what we set up was this liquid oxygen system where it comes as a liquid and it's under pressure, and it pushes the oxygen gas into the water, into this LHO. And it's a low-head oxygenator. There's tanks on the right of this and tanks on the left of this. That sounds like a bad song. But the oxygen gets tubed into this, and we can control the amount of oxygen in the water in this building more than anywhere else on our whole facility. So we can raise almost 300 pounds of fish in each one of those tanks, which is good. We like to keep the fish inside as much as possible, not only for predators, but rain events, stuff like that. They're just more secure. Here's just a quick photo of our feed shed. We keep all of our bagged feed in there. We go through a lot of feed. In the spring, we stock out about 105 yearling rainbows, and that equates to about 35,000 pounds of fish. So it takes a lot of pounds of feed to get to 35,000 pounds of fish weight. So this is a pretty large building that holds our feed. I used part of this slide before. I had some additions to it. Hopefully I can keep the correct pace here. I had some notes that were only supposed to show up for me, but you know, technology escaped me once again. So I'll have to muddle through this. But in the 50s and 60s, lots of rod and gun clubs, and there's still a lot of those, they initiated stream habitat projects where they would fence off cattle access from the stream. They would, that was probably the main one. And then the banks could kind of repair themselves a little bit. And they did all this work, but by the 80s, they figured out that all these trout that they were stocking just weren't surviving. And why is that? And so in 1986, there was a bunch of fish taken from a high-quality trout stream and transferred to a lesser quality trout stream. And what they found was those fish that they transferred not only survived in the other stream, but reproduced and provided fisheries, and they didn't have to stock them anymore. So the light bulb finally went on, and they figured out these wild fish, makes sense, right? Do better than the domesticated fish. And so in the 90s, DNR biologists pushed for a statewide wild trout program. So in 95, it was initiated in Wisconsin, and Nevin Hatchery became wild. Sounds kind of weird. Now, here's where I was going to have a picture of the staff, but I figured I wouldn't. It wouldn't be funny because they're not here. But although they'll probably watch this video on the Fitchburg public access and give me grief later, so I should have done something. But remember I'd mentioned this wild and domesticated fish. Well, there's a big difference. The column on the right, that's our rainbow trout. They're a domesticated strain. They grow really fast. They're a very aggressive fish. You didn't see any feeders out on the raceway photos what we had. What we end up doing there, we have a bucket and we just walk along and throw feed out and spread the fish out so they grow at a pretty uniform rate. Easy husbandry. They're simple. Anybody can raise them. There's not a lot of tricks to them. You can really stuff them in the tanks and they don't mind it and they still grow. And typically what we have with those fish is we have a certain size they need to be stocked out at. And so for me, being the hatchery foreman, I order all the food and everything. So for me, I already know when the fish leave, and we always get them at a certain time of year, so they're on a growth curve. So we feed them a certain amount, and that equates to a certain size at the end of the cycle. It's very, very, very simple. I wish the other fish were that simple to raise, and that would be the fish on the left, the wild strain fish, our Brooks and Browns. They don't grow as fast. They're wary. They startle easily. They don't eat a lot of food. They don't put on a lot of weight or size compared to the rainbows. You got to keep low tank densities, so very few in the tanks. But they're genetically proven they survive and reproduce in the wild, whereas the domesticated rainbows really don't. They're kind of the put and take fishery, kind of instant gratification. Our Brooks and Browns are stocked in hopes that in 2, 3, 4 years they survive, reproduce, and we don't have to stock the stream anymore. Because we never have enough rainbow trout to satisfy all the quotas for those domesticated fish. So what they did in the 90s, they collected fish from the wild, and we brought them back to the hatchery here to spawn them. This happens usually in October, November, December. And it was awesome. We got to do all of our work inside. It was controlled. Fish did great. And this was actually us last week. We were up at Katy Creek, which is up by Eau Claire. The previous slide was the brown trout up at Timber Coulee. That's over by La Crosse. And this next stream is Katy Creek, which is up by Eau Claire, and it has brooks in it. And so instead of bringing the fish back to Nevin, that's a big biosecurity risk for us. We always have, right now, how many fish do we have on site? We've probably got 700,000 fish on site right now. So we don't really want to bring back wild, untested fish from out in some random stream and bring them in and get them on our water source and cause problems. Other facilities have had that happen, and they have to depopulate the whole place and then hose it down with disinfectant, and that's not what we want to do. So instead of bringing the fish back, we figured out we'll make these in-stream fish holding pens. They're made of stainless steel, so they're pretty strong. That tank there is about, or tank, that cage is about 8 feet long, and it's probably about 30 inches deep, about 30 inches, 36 inches deep, 30 inches wide, give or take. So we can keep a couple hundred fish in there. So the fish that we collected, and it's hard to see, but in that tub, there's brook trout. They're probably 8, 9, 10-inch fish. Is all the bigger they get in that stream. But they have the eggs and the right genetics for what we want. So we'll go up there every week now for the next 4 to 5 weeks and spawn them stream side, bring back the eggs to the hatchery, and raise them up. So this was what it'll look like when we spawn. That's a wild brook trout. That's pretty tiny fish, isn't it? You can't hardly see the fish behind his hands. But what we're going after is genetics there. So that fish will have maybe 250 eggs per female in it. Whereas these are our captive strain. And I was going to make a slide explaining this process a little bit more, but I'll try and quickly go through it. Those eggs we bring back, these eggs we'll bring back to the hatchery, raise the offspring until they are this size, and then we spawn these fish. So they're one generation removed from the wild, but we cannot get enough eggs from a couple of hundred fish this size to satisfy our quota for brook trout every year. So what we do is we almost extrapolate it out. That big female sitting in the middle of that tub, that fish probably has 5 or 6 times the eggs that the other fish does. So we need to come up with 150,000 brooks that we stock every year. We don't just start out with 150,000 eggs. You need probably 700,000 or 800,000 eggs to make those, because you lose a bunch every step of the way. So you can see, remember how orange these eggs were? Look at these. So you can tell the diet we give these fish is not as diverse as the diet that they get out in the streams. So the egg quality is the same, they're just a different color. And same with that fish. That fish is not as brightly colored as this fish. So that's kind of neat. So you can see these jars are basically full of eggs. They'll sit in those jars for about 30 days, give or take, and then we pick off the dead eggs. And that's what the person's doing in the lower right photo. We have them spread out kind of in a layer, and you really can't see any white ones on that tray. That's a good thing. Our wild fish do really well. Their fertilization is a lot higher than the fish we have on site. We're still trying to figure out why that is. You would think it would be the opposite. So this is what we'll be doing in the next couple of months. This is us spawning our captive broodstock brown trout outside in November and December. Hopefully we will be done by Christmas. We have been the last couple years, so that's a good thing. We figured out instead of bringing all those really large fish inside, because they're like that size. Not all of them, but some of them are. We spawn 3, 4, and 5-year-old browns. That's a very large male, probably a 5-year-old male. But we can't bring that size fish into our building. We end up spawning 1,500 fish. So we can't bring that many inside. So we figured out, well, why don't we just do it outside? So we bought some of these ice fishing tents. And you can see the number of people that are involved in this process. It's not a 2-person job. There's somebody that has to knock the fish out. That's the tub that's sitting here. There's a fish anesthetic that we use to knock the fish out, so it's easier on the fish. We can get all the eggs out, and it's much easier on us as well, instead of fighting the fish. It's not like the fish just sit there and let you squeeze the eggs out of them. So we knock the fish out. That's in that tub. They go inside. Actually, that's not. These are the knockout tubs here. That's usually my job, because you kind of have to have the right amount of chemical in there. You want to knock them out so you can handle them, but not knock them out so much you kill them. So that's not for the rookies of the bunch. But there's a couple people inside spawning the fish, and then we've got other people outside. They wash the eggs off. The fish then gets put into this tub, and that's got a salt bath in there for recovery, and then they get put back into the raceway. So I'm walking, that's me, I'm walking down with a net full of fish to put in this section here. The fish we have not spawned yet are up in here being held in this seine. So it's kind of a neat thing. I know I cheated and looked on the Fitchburg Historical website at the latest newsletter. There's a couple of errors in there. We are open to the public. I know it said in there we are not. We are open to the public. And the phone number is wrong too, which I guess isn't a big deal. Then I don't have to answer the phone as much. But that's all on the cards in the back. Is that big fish? So there's a big pan of brown trout eggs. Those browns will have 2,000 to 3,000 eggs, depending upon how big the fish are. We do a lot of our own plumbing. As you can see, I'm sure that's all up to code. But these egg jars they hold roughly 40,000 eggs each. So there's times where if you come over, that's in the basement downstairs, we take one of the tanks, we rear fish in and set these jars up. So here's another photo. There's a few big jars in here. Those will hold 100,000. So we're dealing with a lot of eggs. This gentleman here, this is our mechanical egg picker. So earlier I showed the slide, that person manually picking off the bad eggs. When you're dealing with 1.5 million eggs, you can't hand pick eggs. So we use this egg picker that kicks out the bad eggs, and so that saves us a lot of time. When I first started down there, we used to hand pick everything. And that was days and days where you just sit there with these tweezers and pick off bad eggs. Not so much fun. So I had mentioned the eyed egg before, and this is an eyed egg. You can see the fish's eyes right there. So once they get there, it's about 10 days, give or take, from that fish hatching. So once they get to this point, we put them in incubators, and I didn't bring one of those. But they're kind of like just trays with window screen on the top and the bottom that water flows through. Kind of the same principle as this. You have upwelling water, and the fish end up hatching in there. And this is what they look like. After they hatch, they have a yolk sac that at our water temperature of 50 degrees, they feed off of that yolk sac for about 40 days. And at that point, we start to feed them. Rainbows are a little different animal. They eat about a week and a half after they hatch. So this is a tank of roughly month-old rainbow trout, and there's about 50,000 in that tank. I counted all of them, too. So here's another thing we do. We do clipping fish. We take certain fins off. The most common one is this adipose fin, and that's the one that's up on the back between the dorsal and caudal fin. And they use that to assess stocking. So like these are fish that have been clipped. So a stream might have a quota of 500 fish, and they want them clipped. And so we have to knock the fish out with that anesthetic and clip them, and they will get stocked. And then at a later date, the fish biologist will go through and do that electroshocking process and collect all fish around that target size, and they'll look whether it has that fin missing or not. If the fin's missing, it came from us. If it's not, well, it was a natural fish. So they can determine, A, if we need to stock that stream anymore, and B, how the fish did when they were stocked. So it's a long, tedious job to do, but I always like it because then we get feedback on our product too. Because we don't typically get to stock a lot of fish. We just raise the fish, and so we have a good relationship with the other part of fisheries management, but we want to know more so we can put out high-quality products. So this is kind of how we get the fish, either moving them around on site or stocking them. That's a seine they're pulling, and the top part of it in the left photo, that's got corks that float, and there's a panel of netting, and on the bottom are lead weights. And so this is another thing. You can't just go out in the store and I want to buy a seine. Yeah, good luck. So we built that last winter, and there's a lot of that kind of stuff that goes on. The actual day-to-day fish stuff is, depending upon the time of the year, it's not like you're working with fish 8 hours a day. There's about 2 hours, and then the rest of the time you're fixing something, which is fun. You got to be kind of part carpenter, plumber, electrician. So no 2 days are really the same, and the year, it's kind of the same thing every year, but it's not like you're working on an assembly line where you're doing the same thing. So it is a super job. I'm really lucky the job I have. I'm kind of in between. I do some supervisory stuff, but I can kind of determine what I do day to day, and that's kind of nice. So in the picture on the right, we're moving fish from a raceway to another raceway. As the rainbow trout get larger, we spread them out because we can't raise 100,000 in one section of raceway. So that was just what we were doing last week. We also moved fish out to our ponds. Because of the water this summer, we've been really behind. So this fall has been crazy busy, but we're moving fish from our raceway. That's what we did. The fish on the left, we put on this really big truck. We take them out to the pond, and we tube them and let them go right into the pond. So you can see they're probably about 5.5 inches long, give or take. We put 30,000 in there. Took us all day to do it because we can only fit about 6,000 per trip. So challenges. Alan had mentioned about a lot of different stuff going on. Rain events. We're at work a lot. We're glorified farmers. We're fish farmers is what we are. You know, all the glowing schooling and everything. I don't know that a lot of that really comes into play. We're mostly farmers. You have to be somebody who has really good kind of skills just looking at things, good observation skills and seeing what's going on. Well, we're in this place all the time. Before I came over here, I was in there. I had to feed small fish this morning and clean screens. The fall, the leaves come off the trees blow around, and it inevitably ends up in the raceway. All this water is flowing. We've got a lot of work to do from that standpoint. So you can see the water. There's a lot of water in this photo, and not really where we want it. So I was in when we got that 6 inches of rain. When I left, this is when I left it, what it was like. I'd cleaned the screens off and everything, and there's not much else I can do. I left, I got to Middleton, and the belt line was closed because there was water coming over the road over there. What had happened, as soon as I left and got on the road, the storm that looked like it was kind of heading north stopped, spun, and dumped 5 inches back on us. So this whole area here flooded, and the water flooded. Water only leaves the hatchery so fast, and when you get that kind of rain, the ground is always saturated around there anyway. That's why we're there. Partly is the water, but when it comes like that so fast, there's nothing you can do. It's not like screens were plugged. We got inundated with water. So we lost about 14,000 rainbow trout in this event.
Downstream?
Someplace. Yep. We picked probably 4,000 out of the grass, and the rest, when we figured out once we moved them the other day how many we lost. We had 60,000 in these 2 sections of raceway, and we lost probably 14,000.
So did they wind up in that creek? Is it?
Yeah, from that photo, see if I can go, I don't know if I want to go back too far. But the aerial photo is probably way farther than I wanted to go, but I'm committed now. Wow, that is way back. So this water, all the water on site, eventually leaves here, and if you can follow my mouse, there's this V-shaped settling ditch that the waste settle out, and then the stream kind of goes down this way. You can kind of see it because of the trees. But there's also tile and everything else back here has been drained. But that was the other deal about this picture, was the amount of just swamp area to the backside. So my super corny joke when I have kids around in July and it's hot and buggy that, like, yeah, this is inside the gate is the fish hatchery, and on the other side is where the mosquito hatchery is. Because it can be bad. It can be bad. So let's get back to that. But that ends up flowing into just downstream of the belt line where it crosses over in Monona. It goes past Madison Met Sewerage District and ends up dumping into pretty much Upper Mud Lake. All right, let's see if I can get back to where we're here. Challenges, lots of rain, yes.
How is the food provided to the fish? Do you have mechanized vehicles that puts it out, or do you have tubing that runs underneath? How are they fed?
Wow, that does sound pretty spectacular. How are the fish fed? We feed them pretty much all by hand. There's other facilities. We have been termed the Amish hatchery because that radon tower is pretty much the highest piece of new equipment that we have, besides that mechanical egg picker, which is worth its weight in gold.
Everything else is from 1876.
Pretty much. The concrete, there's a lot of concrete work that needs to be done, and I will get to that in one of these slides. So, the rain event. So this pond was empty when I left. And when I came back in the next day, thankfully we didn't have fish in there, or they would have been gone. This is the first time since I've worked down there that we've had water come up from the creek and backflow into the ponds. So that blue hose that's sitting right here, that's attached to a 4-inch trash pump that's about under 6 feet of water. So we had to take that out and tear that apart and fix that. So a lot of mechanical work. You learn a lot from the job too, so that's good. So this is what it's supposed to look like. This is what it looks like if you go down there right now. But it doesn't really look that different. But when this has no water in it, and then you come in, it looks like this, and that's kind of scary. But try to be optimistic. We were just glad we didn't have fish out there, or that would have been a real mess. So, predators. Somebody asked about that earlier. Awesome. Perfect. So what we have 3 main types of birds and 3 main types of fur bearers that are down there. So we've all probably seen maybe the top left, and bottom right. Top left is a belted kingfisher. They don't get real big. They don't like the fish any too big for what we have outside. Usually they can only handle fish probably 3 inches long. Green herons, the middle left, and then great blue heron is probably our biggest challenge. Those birds they can figure things out. I always say they know timing-wise when we leave and when we get there. So when we have this time change that I think happens next week, we'll see birds either in the morning or at night. I can't ever remember which one. But when our schedule changes, those birds, they're there seriously 10 or 15 minutes after we leave. So the netting and running the water down low, we try to not have to deal with them in other ways. Mink, upper right, got a lot of mink in that swamp area. It's perfect habitat. And even otters. A lot of people are surprised about otters. And then raccoon. You guys are probably like, raccoon? They're not really fish eaters, but what they do is they're lazy, and so what they do is they go on those feeders that we have outside after we leave, and then they crawl up on them and grab the food out, and they eat some of the food, which is fine, whatever. But the worst part is if they grab the belt that the food is on and then they pull it, all the food dumps into the water, so the fish don't get it, and then it makes a mess. So predators are always a challenge. More challenges, a lot of weekend work. It kind of comes with holidays too. The horny joke is always the fish don't know it's Christmas. They don't know it's whatever. So Alan and Barbara, I actually do come in to do work when I leave your house at Christmas time. If you thought I went and took a nap or something. Hatchery staffing levels. We have full-time people who work there and 1 limited-term employee. We used to have 4. There's still the requests are always made, so it's always tough to kind of do some things. Stagnant budgets. We don't really get any more money year to year, but the food costs are a lot more money. We get contracted feed from Oregon and Utah, and sometimes that doesn't show up on time, which can be kind of tricky. So that's why I usually like to carry a lot of feed, just in case the truck runs late. Yes?
Going back to the staffing, so that's 4 people, but you had a big crew doing the spawning. Do they come in from other central or other sites or something?
Yes, there is a hatchery in Lake Mills as well, and their busy time is kind of the opposite of our busy time. So
they're dealing with different species?
They do deal with rainbow trout, but it's a different strain. Their strain goes to Lake Michigan. Our strain all gets stocked inland. And they have walleye and northern pike. So by this time of year, they don't have any cool water species like walleye or northern pike on site. So they have covered raceways, so they don't run into predatory issues there. So we kind of help them in the spring when they're harvesting their walleye and northern pike ponds, and they come and help us. We have other people, the fisheries management staff, the biologists, and fisheries technicians, and everybody that come and help. It's good. It's good for people to come in and see how it works a little bit. Yes?
Doesn't the DNR have a fish hatchery in Minocqua too?
Yes, there's one in Minocqua, Spooner, Bayfield, Brule, Osceola, St. Croix Falls, Kettle Marine Springs, and Wild Rose is the one that's probably people know the most about. That's the biggest one because they raise a lot of different types of fish there, and they've had like a $35 million renovation that was done. It's probably 10 years ago now, but that place it's awesome if you can ever get up there. So compared to that, but they have alarm systems that run all their pumps. All their water is pumped, so if they run into problems with that, the supervisor there, I don't know how the guy sleeps because there's alarms that are constantly calling him, different things, different levels for water quality, whatever. So for us, it's kind of nice. The only thing we really have to worry about is if the power goes out to our radon tower, but it reverts back to artesian flow, so the water is really only off for maybe a minute and it's back on.
You have to worry about nitrate levels in the groundwater?
No, not nitrate. It's more just the straight nitrogen gas. Nitrate, maybe in some of our water that leaves, but the food is specially made where that's not really an issue. The radon is the bigger one, and well, the nitrogen, because that's tough on small fish especially. Yes?
You say what it is you feed the fish?
It's basically kind of like, it's an extruded feed based mostly out of fish meal, and there's vitamin pack in there and different proteins. As the size of the fish changes, we feed them different types of feed. And so the higher quality feed gets fed to our Brooks and Browns, and the lower quality feed gets fed to the Rainbows. Because you could like throw this remote in the water and they'd eat it. I'm serious, they're like ravenous. They don't care. You can feed them the cheap feed. The cheap feed is about 50 cents a pound. And the expensive feed is about $3 a pound. But we don't go through much expensive feed because we don't keep the fish. The fish don't stay, most of our Browns and Brooks don't stay past 5 inches. So they don't eat a ton of food to get to that point.
You've not mentioned lake trout, which we also have in our state.
Lake trout is the only other native trout, but that's only found in lakes in very...
You don't deal with them?
We do not. The hatchery up at Bayfield does. There's only a few inland lakes that get lake trout or have an existing population of lakers, but most of the fish go to Lake Michigan or Lake Superior from that facility. That probably would have been a pretty good slide to add is the locations of all the different DNR hatcheries. For the most part, if they're on water that ends up into the Great Lakes, that's where their fish go. Kind of a biosecurity, VHS type of thing.
Lake Geneva is all wild, native lake trout. They're not stocked.
Lake Geneva, I'm not sure. I thought that got some fish from there. I could be wrong.
Okay.
Some of the species that we don't deal with directly, I don't have a ton. I think it's more, there's that one, and then what's the other one in the central? Green Lake.
Green Lake, yes.
Green Lake, I think they come from there too. I don't know if they get stocked every year or not.
How does Wisconsin's hatchery program compare with other states?
Wow, loaded question. As far as just in general?
Bigger, more scientifically advanced, older. What kind of comparisons can you make?
Well, I had a really
Should we
nice...
be proud?
a really nice opportunity this summer to go to the cold water fish culture class in Bozeman, Montana for 2 weeks. And there you meet a lot of people from all over the U.S. And all I can tell you is the feds spend a lot of money for their hatchery system. They got all the toys, they've got the automated feeders, like the throw food, and they don't hardly have to touch food. They just hit buttons on a computer and it does all this stuff manually or automatically. As far as other states, to be honest, I have not been to all of our hatcheries. There's some, I've never been to Kettle Moraine Springs. I've never been to Spooner Hatchery. I don't know why I have never been there, but our place here is probably, again, a lot of people call it the Amish hatchery because it's just, we don't need anything. We don't have to have it, and they don't want to spend the money on, when you got stuff that comes up. Me and my supervisor always joke, it's like, you come in and it's like, okay, what's the fire you got to put out today? You have a plan of what you want to get done, then the phone rings, and then it's like, oh boy, well, we got to do this, and go and do this. So a lot of that, if there's any extra money for different types of projects, a lot of times it goes to the whatever fire is here. Money gets transferred around and used as a whole. It's kind of we're a big team with fisheries management and the other hatcheries. But I haven't been to too many other other states' hatcheries either, but I imagine we're all fairly similar, run on pretty limited budgets. We're pretty much based on user fees and license fees, and we've had declining license sales because of the demographic is just getting older, and not a lot of the younger people are getting into it. They did a survey, and they kind of figured out what was going on, and a lot of people thought it was, oh, the regulations are too cumbersome, it's too confusing, and a lot of it's just time. There's so many other things that people do that, honestly, I bought a trout stamp this year. I did not trout fish one time. And in the past 5 years, I've probably trout fished 5 times. I always like it when I do it, but it's always tough to find time. So, a lot of challenges. Habitat improvement. I think we'll try and get done. I got some videos at the end. If they play, great. If they don't, that's fine. This is called a lunker structure. This is what some of our Southern District operations crew installs in streams for overhead cover. That's what trout like. And they can't be picked off by predators from above or whatever. And they like the kind of shade too. A lot of non-fish job aspects. I had mentioned plumbing, carpentry. We do a lot of tours on site. UW Vet School comes at least a couple times a year and does work with us. National Guard troops came a few years back. They were going to Afghanistan to help people set up some hatchery type things over there, and so they came. We had to show them how to do certain things. That was super interesting. A lot of career day things, job shadows, that stuff. We're part of this new R3 program to recruit, retain, and reactivate people to get our license sales up so we can kind of put the best product out there. And another big one recently is the trout in the classroom. These schools come and get little fish, sometimes eggs from us, and they raise them up with their kids in class. I think we had 5 different schools that did it last year, and I think we're up to 7 this year. Some as far away as, I want to say Michigan, but that's not it. But up by Lake Winnebago, there's a school that came and got some fish from us. But most of the time, they're local.
You give them rainbows?
It depends on kind of what they want. For the first people that have never done it before, we give them rainbows. Because you can flop them out on the ground for 5 minutes and put them back in the tank and they'll be fine. Where brown trout, you look at them funny and they're just like, I'm just dead. It's not that far off. So most of the time it's rainbows because they are so easy. They go on feed really easy. And having them under some bright lights is fine too. So this is how we used to load trucks. We try to avoid this as much as possible, and we'll see if the video works. We'll dip fish in there, and you can see this part hangs from a scale, and then you weigh them, and so you kind of know about how many fish there are per pound. You get a weight of the whole thing, and then you can extrapolate that out to a number of fish. Well, let's see. Let's see if it plays. This is our fish pump. Oh my gosh, it's playing. And no sound, which is good because it's really loud. But this is in our grow-out ponds. We have the fish all seined up. You can kind of see them. And as this backs out, you'll kind of see what's going on. So instead of us walking in there and grabbing nets of fish and then putting them on a scale to weigh the scale right here to weigh them and then handing them up to the truck driver, this is another really cool piece of equipment that we share with Lake Mills. But how we that's how we get fish onto this truck. So they're in water going up this tube, and when it comes, there's 3 different videos. So this was me filming it, so sorry if it's really poor quality, but it was on my phone. And so how we fill these trucks, each time they come, it'll be about 3,000, they get about 3,000 fish, give or take, about 1,000 pounds. Yes?
How do you get the fish through the pumps, or is this a suction and a straw?
That's the cool part of that. Hopefully it pans to the right a little bit more here.
Fish roller coaster.
Right here. So inside here, it's some impeller that I really want to take this thing apart and look at it, but I don't know if I could get it back together right. But what I think it is, I think that tube in here where the fish come in, I think it's split kind of laterally. I think there's an impeller down on the bottom and there's a screen. And I think that's how it moves the fish and the water through it. Yeah, it doesn't harm the fish at all. But it's really loud. If you're a guy running the throttle on this, you got to have earplugs on. But you can kind of see another thing from the video, and we'll see it on, I think it might be the 3rd one, but from up above. So he's just loading fish into the hopper. You can see there's a lot of fish in there. They don't mind it too much. ZZ Top, yeah. That guy is in love with his beard. But he's one of the full-time staff, and that's actually the supervisor is running the machine. So I think that kicks us to the next. Let's go to the next video, if I can. So this is the fish dropping into the tank, and what you can't see on here is there's a staff gauge on the side. Oh, actually, you can see it. It's right here. So when the fish pulls up, it's static, and the water is at a certain level. So we put fish on here based upon displacement. A pound of fish will displace a pound of water. So we know the volume of water in this tank, and we know the rise in the tank. So that's how we know how many fish to put on. It's very accurate, and it's a lot better on the fish, although they are out of the water for a certain amount of time. But that's quite a distance to walk from the ponds up to the truck. So one more. Whoops, same video. So this is what it looks like in the top. That water comes up the hose, and it makes this corner. I'll lift the lid up on the other side, but the fish just kind of bounce down this, and then they go into the truck. So he's checking his numbers to make sure it's the level is rising the right amount. So those are roughly 8-inch fish.
I know.
So here's where the water comes up, and the water falls through the grate and then back to the pond. So we're not adding any water to it. So these are rainbows. We don't really stock any Brooks or Browns. And the other thing, whoops, I wanted to show there was the lower pond we had already cleared the 30,000 fish out of the day before. And so the upper pond we were working out of, take a look at the amount of algae that blows up after we get the fish out. Those fish are in there, and those rainbows somehow utilize the algae in the pond. Because they grow really, really well out there. But once it gets to the end of the video, you can see on the left all the algae, and on the right, there isn't any. That's sediment from us seining it. We have a bigger seine out here that we seine. You can see there's a cloud of fish out here, and then we take little bites with this seine and feed them right in. So not that we don't really love hauling 25-pound nets from the water to the truck, but when you do that for 35,000 pounds, that gets to be, I'm not opposed to physical activity, but those can be kind of long days, because we'll have 3 or 4 of those trucks that come in that get 1,000 to 1,200 fish per truck. So that's a lot of weight. You divide that out by 4 or 5 people, and that's... So it's a really good piece of equipment, and I've got some glamour shots here to end it before you hook me off the stage. There's a big brown, broodstock brown. See the covers, and that's ZZ Top guy there, pre-big beard. Check that out. So that's a big male brookie. So that is all. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah.
The eggs that you're harvesting from the females, are they fertilized already?
No, they're not.
Okay.
That was one thing I didn't show in any of the photos, but The female, it's called the dry pan method. We'll squirt the eggs of the female into there first, and then we add the milk from the male. And nothing really happens until you add the water. There's a pH shift that happens when you add the water
So
to
you
it.
have to add water to get fish.
You have to add eggs, milk, water, fertilized egg. And those captive fish will fertilize at about 60 to 65%. Which isn't that great. But if you think about what it is in the wild, it's a lot better than what it is in the wild.
So when do those fish actually spawn? They spawn in the winter or in the spring?
They are brooks and browns. They spawn, we will probably check the brooks this week to see if they're ready. But it'll be now till Christmas.
So like the salmon, like at Port Washington, are they going up to spawn this time of year? You know, they go up to...
The salmon?
Yeah, the salmon.
There's different strains of all these fish. Like I said, rainbow trout. Well, there's 5 different strains. And I probably can't even name them all. There's Irwin strain, that's what we have. They all get stocked inland. Our Lee strain, that's what Lake Mills raises and goes into Lake Michigan. Chambers Creek, Ganaraska, and there's one I can't ever remember.
Steelhead.
Well, steelhead.
And
But
those are moving now.
yep, they happen at different times of the year.
So like the salmon, do they actually eat the eggs? Because people use them for bait. They use the fish eggs
Yes,
for bait.
a little bit. We can kind of tell at our facility when our fish are ready to spawn, they start to waste the food. They start to not eat as much. So that's when you know they're getting close, and they're getting close. So because we have such consistent water temperature, and we keep them always in the same section of raceway, they're always getting the same amount of light. So they always spawn around the same time of the year. Whereas those rainbow trout we got transferred in from Osceola, they spawn in July. In certain places, you can photo manipulate when these fish spawn. Wild Rose had a building, it was called their broodstock building. It had no windows. And if you control the light, the timing of the lights, you can control when the fish spawn. It's pretty interesting.
The rainbow trout in the state of Maine, I've seen pictures, 5, 6, 7 pounders. Are those just a whole different species than what we have here, or would you know, or maybe you don't know?
It's hard to say, but a 5 or 6 pound steelhead is not
Oh, I'm sorry, brook trout.
Oh, brook trout?
Yeah.
I don't think there's that many different subspecies or strains of them. A lot of it just has to do with the water body that they're put into. I get that question a lot. It's like, well, how big will these fish get?
Right.
It's like, well, it depends on the amount of water they have, the amount of forage they have. Brown trout like to eat other fish, more so than brooks. Brooks are perfectly content eating aquatic insects or something that are pretty low calorie, but browns, they like to eat anything they can get their mouth around. So they get really big, especially when they get put into Lake Michigan, where the forage base, I don't want to say is unlimited, but there's a lot of forage. So Wild Rose used to stock brown trout into, and they still do, certain types, into Lake Michigan. And because I've caught them. When I was a kid, we'd go out to Green Bay and set tip-ups, and you'd catch 24-inch brown trout that they would be 5 or 6 pounds. And so they might have been a domesticated strain of brown or something. There's different genetic strains. So.
Good. I want to thank Jason for this presentation, and I learned a lot about fishing, and I know him quite well. He's my son-in-law, so.